unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grand Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan. 30 years ago, Seema Sirohi first moved to Washington as a journalist charged with covering India's relationship with the United States. At the time, Washington saw India as a problem, rather than a useful part of its foreign policy solution to big and complex global challenges. Today, the situation could not be more different. The United States and India are deeply enmeshed in a strategic partnership that runs the gamut from space to terrorism and from climate change to technology. Seema narrates this tectonic shift in a new book, Friends with Benefits, the India-U.S. Story. Seema currently serves as a columnist for the Economic Times, but she's covered this relationship for The Telegraph, Outlook, and First Post. To talk about her new book and her own personal journey, Seema joins me on the podcast today from Washington. Seema, congrats on the book.
Thank you. And it's a pleasure to be on your podcast.
Well, I just want to also congratulate you not just on the achievement of this book, but also on the very clever title, which I think is one of my favorite titles of a book in recent memory.
Right. I have to credit a friend who came up with the title. It's not mine.
It's a very millennial title, very keeping with the age. I want to start with the very beginning of the book. The very first page starts by narrating a scenario from a war game sponsored by General Dynamics, a U.S. firm. They do a lot of war gaming. This was in Washington in 1991. And the war game scenario was meant to simulate a possible conflict between India and Pakistan that would eventually draw the United States in as well. Tell us a little bit about this war game and, how did you end up with this scoop?
Well, it was 1991, as you said, and I happened to meet a friend whom I knew in New Delhi, and he was visiting. He was a European think tanker. And we were meeting for lunch. It was just a casual meeting. And we were talking about India, and he happened to mention a briefing that he had just attended, and where India was portrayed as an enemy. And there was this war scenario, and it was pretty hair-raising. And so I started asking him questions and asked him if he had any documents. And he just basically gave me a whole set of documents. So it was, that's how it started. I read that whole thing. There were 5 war scenarios. The one about India and Pakistan was very realistic. It was like Kashmir is boiling over, and the United States fears that they might go to war. And in order to prevent a hot war, the U.S. decides to intervene. That was the scenario. And it intervened on the side of Pakistan and against India. And General Dynamics was this arms manufacturer that had built this scenario, and they were briefing a couple of think tanks, and there were a lot of serving officials attending this meeting. In the scenario, the US decides to sort of rain these new missiles that General Dynamics had just built. And they had longer range than the Tomahawk missile that had just been used in the first Gulf War. And 190 missiles are fired at India at various, military installations and Air Force bases, etc., by American B-52 bombers that fly out of Diego Garcia military base. So it was quite a shocking scenario, kind of realistic, because at that time, the US was quite worried about emerging threats. Although it was a unipolar moment for the Americans, the Soviet Union had disintegrated, but there was all this talk in Washington about new emerging threats. And India was seen as a hostile power. So that was the scoop. And I reported it, and all hell broke loose. And I was denounced by everybody, by the Pentagon, by the State Department. Everybody dismissed the story and said it was not correct, etc., etc. But I was proved right, and I had the documents, so I was just basically waiting for things to blow.
I mean, it's really hard, Seema, I think, sitting where we are today in 2023 to even imagine this scenario, right? That there was a time when it seemed plausible that in a conflict that broke out in on the subcontinent, that the United States would side with Pakistan and deploy these missiles on Indian targets, right? And the reason I wanted to ask you about that is because it shows you what great distance we've traveled between now and then. The book obviously is about U.S. and India, but there are two other major sub-themes of the book, right? In my view, one is the U.S. relationship with Pakistan and how that's evolved, but also the U.S. relationship with China. And that's the one I want to ask you about first. You have early on in the book this line where you say the following. I just want to quote. The battle the Americans are fighting so loudly today to counter China is the result of years of conscious neglect and a lackadaisical attitude to hardcore national security issues and the corruption of money in the political system, end quote. For people who are listening today, they have become so accustomed, we all have, to today's hawkish policy stance on China. Tell us a little bit about how China was viewed by the security establishment for most of the past 3 decades, in the kind of DC foreign policy world.
It was a very different time. Basically, China and Pakistan could do no wrong, and India could do no right, which is what I say in the book. But you have to remember, at that time, the thinking was that US engagement with China would make China change. It would help reformist elements in the Communist Party. And there was a certain naivete about it. They were not, the American diplomats and officials were not listening to Indian diplomats at all on this issue. And it was a big source of distrust. Um, Basically, China was buying US technology openly, legally, and especially during the 8 years of the Clinton administration. There was such an exuberance about corporate investments in China. Everybody was making a lot of money. There were 2, 3 corporations that were selling satellite technology. They were selling military precision technology. I mean, everything that you cannot imagine today being sold to China was being sold. Uh, I say in my book that uh, the Americans helped China to sort of graduate from puberty to adulthood. And I actually believe that. China could rob the bank and not be caught. So they were buying everything, high-end computers. Remember, these computers were not being sold to India. India wanted to buy supercomputers and things like that, but India was denied all that technology. So China could buy everything, and the rest they were stealing. Um, there were moles in various defense laboratories that one was discovered during the Clinton administration. The person had stolen the W-88 technology. W-88 was the smallest nuclear warhead that the US had developed. So when China did the next nuclear test, the Americans woke up and said, wow, this is not something they're supposed to do. This technology, they were supposed to be quite behind in this technology. So how come the results are showing that this is a very miniature warhead? So they woke up, yet the Clinton administration didn't really take any action, didn't sanction China. Um, it was very brazen. It's very difficult to imagine why it was like that. But there was this consensus in Washington and in the larger strategic community in the US. The academics were fueling this as well. All their research or whatever they wrote said it's better to engage China than to distance yourself. So that was the scene.
So, I want to come back to Pakistan, but before I do that, you mentioned the Clinton administration, and you document a shift in the White House view on India at the start of the second Clinton term. So this would have been in 1997. And of course, we know that difficult times would lie ahead with the nuclear tests and the sanctions that followed. But describe for us, why the tone of conversations on India started to change, circa Clinton's second term. What was going on that started to kind of make the wheels turn in a different way?
So, first, there was a realization in Washington that mediation in the Kashmir issue is a non starter. So I think that realization came because the US ambassador at that time in New Delhi, Frank Wisner, was instrumental in explaining to Washington, D.C., that, look, this is not worth pursuing, even though the Pakistanis were pushing the Americans to get involved in Kashmir in, some manner or another in the first Clinton administration. They did that. The Americans were trying to push India on that front. But by the end of the first term, there was a realization that this is a no go area. It's a waste of time. Then the elections in India brought, Inder Gujral as the prime minister. Gujral doctrine, the so-called Gujral doctrine, was about India sort of developing friendly relations in the neighborhood. So there was an acknowledgement in DC that perhaps the new Indian prime minister will make an effort to settle this issue, the Kashmir issue, bilaterally. So there was that recognition. Then 1997 was also the 50th anniversary of Indian independence. So there were a lot of functions and things, celebrations in Washington. And the First Lady, Hillary Clinton, attended the biggest one at the Kennedy Center. So there was a general, good feeling about India and about celebration of democracy. And I must add that Hillary Clinton was also quite instrumental. She had taken a trip to South Asia. She had gone to India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, etc., and had seen the progress made, especially on women's issues and on the issue of microcredits, which, as you know, in Bangladesh was a big, big thing that happened in the 90s that empowered so many poor Bangladeshis. So Hillary came back and talked about South Asia and sort of told her husband, I suppose, that South Asia is not getting the kind of attention for the kinds of issues on which it has made progress. So her interest was quite important. She wanted her husband to visit South Asia, I was told by various officials. And then Madeleine Albright also had kind of a side interest in South Asia because her father, Joseph Corbell, he was a Czech diplomat, and he was the chairman of the India-Pakistan UN Commission after independence, in 1947, to work out the whole Kashmir issue. So there was some interest, at different levels, which I think the ambassador helped coalesce.
I mean, the Hillary Clinton involvement I found to be really fascinating, right? Because it's illustrative of how first ladies, although they may not always get the attention they deserve on the policy side, can have a real impact, right? Because repeatedly during this period in your book, you show how Hillary was raising this issue, right? And then there was this pressure of like the first lady really wants to go on this trip. She thinks it's very important for larger strategic reasons. I don't want to get into the whole sanctions debacle because that's a very long and convoluted story. But suffice it to say that after the nuclear tests in '98 and the Pakistani tests that followed, it was not easy being an Indian journalist in Washington. And you talk about this explicitly in your book. Tell us a little bit about how that darker period in U.S.-India relations, how did that downturn trickle down to the level of the kind of Indian journalist community? What was it like, being here at that time in Washington?
It was hard. The nuclear test just brought the house down on India. And Bill Clinton had actually said that we're going to come down on them like a ton of bricks. And they did. Wherever you turned, some American official was berating India, condemning India, and using the most intemperate language. It was hard to listen to it day after day after day and then report on it and try to be professional about it. Since I am an Indian, it hurt because as an Indian, I sort of understood the logic behind the tests. For years, China and Pakistan had a nuclear nexus, which the Americans were refusing to recognize. And Pakistan was getting more and more emboldened. Its nuclear program was progressing, etc., etc. The Americans took no action. Plus, the 1962 war that India and China had fought. That's a kind of subconscious memory for me as a young child. I remember that. So here I was thinking, why don't the Americans get it? I tried very hard to keep my private and professional lives apart, but it was not easy.
So there's just sticking on the personal here for a second. Many of our listeners will be familiar with the Backchannel talks that emerged between then Deputy Secretary of State Strobe Talbot, who then went on to be president of the Brookings Institution, and Jaswant Singh. Of course, a very well-regarded bureaucrat and politician, to try and resolve the U.S.-India dispute after the nuclear test. What they won't be familiar with is that a dinner party at your home, on your deck in your backyard, had a key role to play in advancing these talks. Tell us a little bit about what happened there that helped to get the ball rolling on this.
Well, I have to admit that I had no clue of this at the time. I had a dinner party. My then husband, we are divorced now, was, as luck would have it, was in the India department of the State Department. He's an American diplomat. And then there was this friend of mine in the Indian embassy called Taranjeet Sandhu, who happens to be today India's ambassador to the U.S. So Taranjeet and Chris were friends. They were both young diplomats. They used to chit chat. And because I was always going to the Indian embassy as a journalist, so I knew Taranjeet well. So I had this dinner party and I was busy, looking after guests. But on the deck, Chris and Taranjeet had a conversation about which I found out many, many years later. Where Taranjeet explored with Chris that is there a way to start for the two countries to start talking? And because, this whole thing about deriding India, condemning India is going over the top and something has to give. So Chris apparently told Taranjeet that he'll check and get back to him, which apparently he did a few days later. And Americans were willing to open some sort of back channel, but they had a few conditions, that they should be somebody high level and not a foreign ministry bureaucrat. Because somehow the Americans had decided that the Indian foreign secretary at that time had misled them, had deceived them about the nuclear tests, etc., etc. So they wanted a political person who had direct access to the prime minister to do these talks. So Taranjit told Naresh Chandra, the ambassador, and Naresh Chandra, since he knew everybody in New Delhi, he got it going. He decided there should be just one Singh, and he consulted the prime minister, and everything worked out. So I had no idea at that time, of course.
Hey, Grant Tamasha listeners. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grant Tamasha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out. It's a fascinating story. I mean, I knew that important discussions happened on your deck, Seema. I didn't know that they were raised to this level. But just kind of going forward a bit, you spend quite a lot of time in the book, for good reason, talking about the breakthrough with India that took place during the George W. Bush administration. I think even Democrats in Washington would admit that the sea change really happened under this Republican president. And we know about the next steps in strategic partnership and the eventual civil nuclear deal and so on and so forth that came from this administration. But what I've always been curious about, and you touch on this a bit in your book, is, why is it that Bush came into office with India kind of so firmly planted on his brain, right? It's not like immediately obvious to somebody that this son of a former president, governor of Texas, former business person would sort of have this view. What do you think was it about India that kind of, floated to the top for this president?
So it actually goes back to the whole Bush family. Bush Senior, George H.W. Bush, was very friendly with an Indian American doctor called Zachariah in Florida, who Zachariah became a very major fundraiser for the Bush family. And Jeb Bush and George W. Bush kind of knew this family as well, because the two families became very close over time. So George W. Bush kind of was very familiar with India, basic facts about India, that it's a democracy, it's a large country, etc. So yeah, he was very positively inclined. And the question he would always ask is, why are the two countries, both of them democracies, why aren't they better friends? So he came to office with that kind of mindset. He was very familiar with India and Indians. Then he was also inclined to think that China is a potential rival. I remember in one of his campaign speeches before the elections, he mentioned that very clearly, and then again mentioned India, that it's important to make better friends with India. It's a large country, an important emerging economic power. George W. Bush's brain trust, if I may call them that, consisted of also people who looked at the world differently, especially China. There was Condoleezza Rice, there was Robert Blackwell. Uh, they didn't, they saw that China could be a potential rival of the US, and they had written papers about it. So when they briefed Bush, his feelings got more sort of strengthened about India. So that was his mindset when he came into office.
As I mentioned before, and you also alluded to, Pakistan plays a key role in your telling of U.S.-India relations over the past couple of decades. And at one point in the book, you're referencing the period of the 2000s. You write this, and I just want to quote, "It would take years for the U.S. State Department to develop basic sensitivity and stop telling India to open a dialogue with Pakistan in the immediate aftermath of a terrorist attack. Sometimes I wondered if U.S. diplomats were deliberately insensitive or so high on their perch that they couldn't see life below, end quote. Like pretty damning stuff, and it comes back again and again. This is a big question, Seema. It's one that people have tried to cover in books, but I'm just curious, from your perspective as a journalist covering this for more than 30 years, why did it take so long for U.S. officials to recognize the double game that Pakistan had been playing for so long?
I would say the US officials knew and recognized everything about Pakistan's double games. Uh, but because of US geostrategic interests in South Asia at that time, they chose to ignore the evidence. I mean, the US has at that time, 13 intelligence agencies, right? They were giving real time intelligence to the State Department, to the Pentagon. So it's not as if US officials didn't know what was going on. Um, but the larger aims always kind of convince them that uh, taking action against Pakistan would not serve their interests. Remember, there was a war going on in Afghanistan in the 80s. Americans were trying to defeat the Soviets in Afghanistan. They were using Pakistan to send money and weapons to the Mujahideen. It was supposedly a covert war, but it was a very overt war, actually. Um, so Pakistan was extremely important for US goals at that time. India, on the other hand, was seen as being in the opposite camp. India had not condemned the Soviet invasions in so many words. And in fact, India was close to the Soviet Union because when Americans started using Pakistan so openly and so significantly, India felt it needed some sort of backing from the other power in its corner. It didn't want to be caught alone in this big geopolitical drama that was sort of unfolding. Then, even after 9/11, when it was very evident that um, Osama bin Laden had kind of taken shelter in the badlands of Pakistan, the Bush administration was hesitant to take any action. In fact, they declared Pakistan a major non-NATO ally. Again, because the US was dependent on Pakistan for supply routes, etc. They had to supply the US forces. Sometimes the Americans were so convinced, or they would appear so convinced that I would doubt my own, intelligence and information. They would say, "Oh, Pakistan has turned a new leaf, and they're not supporting terrorism," because Pervez Musharraf, at that time, the president slash dictator of Pakistan, was feeding them something that, oh, I'm on the face of moderate Islam, etc.
Reformism and so on.
Exactly. So Washington would buy that storyline. Even after Osama bin Laden was found in Pakistan, this was during the Obama administration. And if you remember, US officials didn't warn Pakistan about that operation, right?
Correct.
Why? Because they knew very well that the information.
Someone would tip them off.
Exactly. So the ISI was known for leaking information. So the Americans would go with this operation and find nobody there. People had fled by then. So for the Osama bin Laden operation, the Americans didn't tell the Pakistanis. But even after that, um, the Obama administration didn't call Pakistan out, did not publicly say that it was the ISI, the Pakistani intelligence agency, and the Pakistani military who were harboring this guy. They bought the line that, oh, we didn't know, the Pakistanis said, oh, we didn't know he was there. How can they not know? He was living a few miles from Pakistan's very elite military academy. So it was like that. It was a very difficult thing. Americans know it. They knew it for decades, what Pakistan is up to. After all, they have very good intelligence information.
There are a couple of racy chapters about the so-called Cobodagade affair in 2013, 2014. And I remember this period really well because I started at Carnegie in 2012. So this happened soon after. And for listeners who may not recall, Devyani Cobodagade was a deputy consul general at the Indian consulate in New York. She was arrested. I think she was dropping her kids off at school. She was arrested on charges of visa fraud, failing to pay her housekeeper a guaranteed minimum wage. She was arrested. She was strip searched. This prompted a really furious, frenetic diplomatic back and forth between the two countries. So without getting into kind of all the ins and outs of this case, right? And now with the benefit of hindsight, well, why did this arrest almost bring the relationship to its knees, right? I mean, sort of now we think of it as like, oh, there was this blip. But I remember at the time, I mean, it was like a crisis, right? I mean, you were thinking like, what was the next shoe to drop? What was it about this that sort of captured the imagination in a sense on both sides?
The very fact of an Indian woman diplomat being strip searched by US Marshals made Indians furious. The reaction was very angry. Everybody, once it became public, that is, people talked about the American arrogance, etc. And the fact was, I just felt that imagine if an American woman diplomat was taken to a police station in New Delhi and strip searched. What would the American reaction be? It would be furious, right? But somehow Americans thought Indians are overreacting. That wasn't the case. I don't think Indians overreacted. They were legitimately angry at this thing. And somehow this whole episode was allowed to unfold. It was as if there was no political direction in the entire State Department, right? Firstly, the US Embassy itself in New Delhi, which is a very large embassy, right? There was a woman diplomat that the ambassador was Nancy Powell. If she had been on top of the game, she would have scotched it in the early stages, this whole investigation against Khobragade. The thing to do in these kind of circumstances where a diplomat is flouting a law is to get the diplomat out of that country.
Right, you get them recalled, basically.
Yeah, you get them recalled and you declare them persona non grata or whatever. There are many, many diplomatic ways to deal with the problem. But no such thing happened. When the Indian reaction was furious, the Americans just told us all the time that, oh, it's the law. It's the law that's unfolding. We really cannot take any action. We cannot intervene. So the Indian side felt that they felt a bit of as if Americans were showing a kind of superiority. Look, you brown people, let us teach you about the law. There was a kind of an evangelism. To the credit of the State Department, they did institute certain rules in the aftermath of this affair where the diplomatic security people who initiated the investigation are now expected to brief diplomats, regional bureaus, etc., as to what they are pursuing so things don't get out of hand. The Indian side also has taken action that if you're going to bring help with you, you need to pay minimum wage. So both sides learned a good lesson from it.
Shortly thereafter, Narendra Modi comes to power in 2014, and there's a lot of uncertainty about how he will view the United States and how the Obama administration, frankly, will approach him, right? I mean, this is somebody who had a visa that was revoked, who was denied a visa, right? He was basically persona non grata as far as the U.S. system was concerned. Ultimately, we now know, of course, the two sides went in for a full mutual embrace. Well, wasn't an obvious outcome at the time. I'm curious, Seema, again, with hindsight, what are the factors that you think shaped this eventual thaw and what had been this decade-long period of almost complete U.S. disengagement from Narendra Modi when he was chief minister of Gujarat?
Just a brief note about the visa problem. It was the administration of George W. Bush that had put the visa ban on Narendra Modi. So now that President Obama was in charge, his people reported to him that Modi is a rising star, is most likely to win the elections, and uh, the US Embassy has kind of been ignoring him. So the political elements in the State Department, most importantly, Nisha Biswal, who was the Assistant Secretary of State now, uh, she is a Gujarati Indian, if you know. So she sensitized other officials and the White House that, look, he's going to win. And the Americans then decided it's the verdict of the Indian people. They are nobody to question who the Indian people vote for. And he came with such an overwhelming mandate that it would have looked foolish for the Americans to question Modi. Nisha Biswal also had made it very clear early on to the Indian side that whoever is elected, we are going to respect the choice of the people. So it was pragmatism, it was necessity, call it what you will. Uh, Even on the Modi side, there was a little bit of doubt whether how Obama would embrace or not embrace Modi, right? Because the whole visa situation. And so there was some effort from Modi's side to get the whole visa decision revoked. But the Obama administration said no, no can do. We cannot revoke the decision, but we are willing to go forward uh, as Modi is the elected Prime Minister of India. And the phone call congratulating Modi came very early on. Obama picked up the phone, called him, and that kind of set the tone for other Western leaders as well. Uh, that if Obama is sort of welcoming Modi, then so should they.
Seema, I want to kind of bring this conversation to an end by asking you where we stand today, right? I mean, you've kind of uncovered 30 years of this relationship. We're recording this, of course, in March of 2023. The Biden administration has about 2 more years left. India is set for its next general elections in May, June 2024. The current government's expected to return. Again, sort of ending with the big picture question, how would you characterize the current state of U.S.-India ties, right, in the context of everything you've seen, right? I mean, where are we today exactly?
So, in short, we are in a very good place. I mean, looking at the trajectory, if you had told me 30 years ago that we would be talking about just about in every subject under the sun, I would have laughed because at that time the relationship was so narrow, if you can even call it a good relationship. So today, India and the US are engaged on many, many fronts. They are good friends. They're just short of being treaty allies, I might say. They agree on most things. And they have similar opinions about China. Lo and behold, something that I would never have expected. But today, there's convergence on China that I might say is a major glue. Then the two are cooperating on this whole entire Indo Pacific policy. There is this grouping called the Quad, the quadrilateral security dialogue, which consists of the United States, India, Australia, and Japan, where the four democracies cooperate on many, many issues. They kind of have built a fence, so to say, around China, sort of, if I can call it that. The National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, has called it the lattice work of alliances and friendships and partnerships. So it seems to me that the convergence is going to last for short to medium term, no questions about that. Um, India's dependence on Russia is decreasing somewhat. That has been a thorn in the relationship. India is trying to diversify its arms purchases. It's buying more from the U.S., from France, from Israel. Um, I would even say that India is tilting towards America. Remember the time when we used to talk about the American tilt towards Pakistan during the Kissinger-Nixon years? But now it's like, it seems to me India is tilting towards the US. Things have gone surprisingly well. When the Biden administration came in, there was a bit of a doubt in New Delhi whether Biden would carry forth with the Indo-Pacific policy that got started under Donald Trump, whether he would take a strong stand against China. On all of those things, Biden administration has furthered all those policies. Instead of going back, they have gone ahead and then some. They've raised the Quad meetings to some leaders level. And the two sides talk all the time. There's a lot of interaction between the two foreign ministries, something that I would never have imagined 30 years ago. So the only problem I see is our trade issues, between the two countries. That remains to be seen if the two countries can resolve those very persistent trade issues. But otherwise, on strategic issues, things are going very well.
My guest on the show this week is the journalist Seema Sirohi. She's the author of a brand new book, Friends with Benefits, the India-U.S. story. Seema, there is a lot of masala in this book. Virtually in every chapter, there is an anecdote, there's a quote, there's some hidden backstory that I certainly didn't know about. I think a lot of people will find it new. Congrats on putting this all together and making it so kind of, page turner-ish, right? You really kind of want to see what's happening next. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you, Milan. Thanks for having me.
Grand Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. Be sure to subscribe and leave a review to help others find the show. Tim Martin is our audio engineer, and Cliff Jayapranada is our executive producer. Production assistance comes from Nitya Lab. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.